Hi, I'm Becky Malby. I'm a visiting professor at the University of York and London South Bank University. But I'm also part of the Primary Care Networks Academy, one of the founding members, and I want to share you some of our work and our thinking about integrated neighbourhood teams. Now, we absolutely know that all high-performing health systems in the world increase their team size, their membership around acuity. But also all high-performing health systems around the world keep people as close to home as possible. And what I want to share with you is some thoughts here about what sorts of needs should integrated neighbourhood teams meet. So I'm going to share my screen and share with you just a few presentation points that will help us along the way. Okay, hopefully you can see this now. All righty, so many of you are involved in the establishment of integrated neighbourhood teams. And what we found is that quite often they're a solution looking for a problem. No one's quite sure what they're for. And that's partly because we don't really know what it means to be integrated. So if you look at the history of integration, you'll find the NHS has been trying to integrate for a very long time. But on the whole, it's a response to fragmentation. And if we're not careful, as we get bigger, what we do is just add more people in. And that, in effect, increases fragmentation. And you might have seen that from some of your work with frailty, that what you've tried to do is to meet people's needs by increasing the available skills to meet those needs. But actually what happens is there's more and more handovers. So what integration means, this is Nick Down and my colleague dug this up from Harvard Business Review, is it talks about the achievement of unity of effort. So trying to bring everybody together in service to meeting need, but then also redesigning the work and the nature of the work in relation to that. And it's the second part we tend to miss out on. So if you look at all the examples of trying to do integrated care in the past, most of them have been evaluated. You know what happens with evaluations, they sit on people's shelves, don't they? Well, we had a look at all of those evaluations, and what we found is there's a bit of a commonality here, some things we can learn. So it works where you've collaborated before. So if it's a brand new collaboration, it takes a bit more time. Absolutely works where citizens are part of diagnosing the problem and determining the solutions from the start. So if you talk to patients and carers, you might be one yourself, you'll know that actually patients and carers feel like the integrator. They tend to know all the phone numbers, all the people that are coming and going. They'll say, actually, most of the care, it happens here in our home between us. And we bring and have support from ranges of other healthcare professionals, but actually we are the ones that sort of bring it all together. And so we understand the needs of our loved one or our own needs, and that's where we need to be starting. So citizens have to absolutely be part of this. And I can't tell you how many integrated neighbourhood teams and integration efforts where citizens are sort of to be observed and maybe there's the subject of our largesse rather than to be an integral part of the team. So first thing, citizens are part of the team. You have to have time to learn together. You have to have system leaders that are absolutely in service to the work and don't just get distracted by the next policy initiative coming down the line in the future. So they just have their attention on this for 6 months and they go off somewhere else. And you need a bit of funding to generate a headspace. You need thinking time, and you'll see why in a minute, because if we're not careful, we'll point integrated neighbourhood teams at the wrong problem, and that'll cost us a lot of money. So things that have got in the way previously with integrated neighbourhood teams or integration projects is difficulty in data sharing, just not entirely clear who makes what decision, expectations are set too high. It's going to solve all our problems, it's going to make everything better, and then it doesn't, because it tortuously takes a while to do that. Not everybody owns it in the same way. There's a lack of experience about working with citizens as partners, and the top gets distracted and doesn't resolve the problems that the teams themselves are facing. So when you're setting up anything to do with integrated neighbourhood teams, please be aware of those fallacies, because across all of those evaluations, what they said was they didn't start from an evidence base. They just sort of leapt into a problem. We're a bit behind on data, so we don't always know what the problems are. The citizen participation didn't happen. And then you just didn't find improvements in the short term. It just takes time. So those are the lessons learned. Let's get on to a little bit about scale, what scale for what work. So here's a story. This was a GP colleague who delved into the history of one lady and he did it, and this is 2 years of his 2.5 years he looked at, and he looked at the number of touch points this lady had had with the service. And you can see right at the beginning, in the first 6 months, that's the top line. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ambulances in that first 6 months. Not so many, and they're different colours of different services, social care or GP or voluntary sector. And as you'll see over the time, after a year, things start ramping up, don't they? And ramping up and ramping up. And this lady was eventually admitted to a mental health institution. And so what the GP said about this when he looked at it, and he looked at it and was sort of teary, that he had no idea that this lady had been to so many services so many times. And of course, there's a phenomenal cost. This is a financial cost, of course, to the NHS of all those appointments and visits and ambulances. But it's also a terrible cost to the family and to the person themselves, their needs not being met. And if this is the amount of times this person is touching health and care services, then obviously there's a lot of distress in the family. And he says, this is what the GP said. He just said, if we'd actually worked together, we might have first identified this person was bouncing around the system. We might have been able to meet their needs. We might have got the right care earlier. She might have done better. And he was really upset about it. And that's sort of the point, that unity of effort. The point is those folks who are turning up frequently around our system. Now we're thinking about what scale and where do we find the solution. When we talk about neighbourhood, it's a geographical space, isn't it? Now, don't you start with the space and then you say, what do we need to do? Rather than saying, what does it reflect in terms of acuity? So you should always keep things as close to people's homes as possible. And general practice is really, really good at dealing with complex needs, actually. It's good at dealing with complex clinical needs. When we get some of those social determinants added in, it gets much more difficult. So general practice can do good clinical work. It can work with its colleagues in a primary care network where it needs more resources, or you need to share resources between you, or you need to share expertise between you. One practice might be really, really good, have somebody that's absolutely great at leg ulcers. Some of you might have another practice that's really, really good at mental health. So you'll want to share that expertise between you. Primary care networks are great for learning and collaborating to meet clinical needs, to help general practice be the best it can be. We get up to locality and neighbourhood. We're starting to think, aren't we, about what other services do we need? What other help do we need that we can't manage within the NHS? And here you start thinking about your voluntary sector and your social care agencies, don't you? And then borough, and then the ICS. And so when you're looking at clinical complexity, you might think about mild and moderately complex, sort of level 1, whatever level 1 is. You can determine that yourselves of practice and community, primary care networks, and then in ICS, which will include your secondary care services and specialist care. You can see how clinical acuity builds through. And here's another way of thinking about it just in relation to primary care, that some things people can deal with their own community, and we want to give the work back. You know, some people who are living in poor housing or poverty or isolated might actually manage well if they had friends and support of their neighbours and their streets. And actually, we could just begin to, actually, it's not, we don't need a clinician here. We need to give that work back. Sometimes it's a health and wellbeing coach and a social prescriber that can really help doing some of those things that help with people's sense of just sense of self-esteem. People who have self-esteem tend to live better, live healthier, you know that. Then we get into general practice, then we get some issues around complexity, and we know that you need more continuity, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But that might be a GP and a nurse, or a GP and a social prescriber, but 1 or 2 people who really, really look after you, your main touch point for your care. And so some level of continuity about people who've got complex needs makes all the difference. You can absolutely radically reduce the amount of times they turn up in the service, and you can meet their needs. And then you might say, well, actually, we need a bit more of a multidisciplinary team around those folks. And then you might say, I need some high intensity multidisciplinary, often pediatrics, where you need a pediatrician to work with a GP and the family collaboratively, again, to keep them as close to home as possible. So can you see how this builds over time? So what we've got to be careful of is this gravitational force, which pulls people up the system. What you want to do is keep people as close to community as possible, adding in expertise around need, not racing straight to the top of the pyramid. So what you don't want to do is develop an integrated neighbourhood team and suck work into it. It has to be about real need, not assumptions about need. So if we start with need, we look at people that turn up frequently in general practice, we'll find there's 2 sorts. There's the people that turn up episodically. So they come probably for a year, something's going on in their lives. They have some level of clinical complexity, some clinical need that's temporary or short term, or they get on top of it and manage it. Maybe a new diabetic, or it might be somebody who's got a lot of stress in their life, their blood pressure's up. They begin to work, you begin to work with them on that over time. They manage to get a job, their blood pressure goes down anyway. They change their diet, they take some meds, and off we are in some regular. So they're less frequent. But on the right here, our long-term high GP attenders are persistent frequent attenders. People are turning up over time for a period of time. And they're really interesting because we don't often know who they are. So we did a little study and had a look. Here's an example of one practice. And you can see these are people who are turning up frequently. And look at the sort of cohorts, not what you'd expect. So here we are, number 2, no long-term conditions, 91 patients taking up nearly 4,000 appointments. Now, if you've got no long-term conditions and turning up frequently, what on earth is going on? And is that general practice working? Can the general practice manage that, or does it need help? So some of these, you'll say, actually, I recognize this, mental health and other long-term conditions, 101 people. Yeah, that's a cohort I recognize of people who are clinically complex and who we need to manage. But back to number 2, that might not be clinical complexity. There might be something else going on. So if these are the folks, if we just put an integrated neighborhood team around frailty, you can see across this group of people, most people won't be eligible for it because it's not meeting their needs. So if we start with integrated neighborhood teams on assumption of need rather than understanding who's turning up and why, and where do they need help, we're going to be spending money in a really expensive resource completely inappropriately. And I can tell you a story about this. I was working with a city not too far from where I live, and they were case finding because they weren't getting enough referrals into their elder people's integrated neighborhood team. And I said, that's really interesting. Does your INT look after children and young people with complex needs? And they said, no. I said, well, this is the youngest city in the country. Surely you need an INT about young people's mental and physical health, because that's turning up a lot in A&E, in general practice. But it didn't have that. It was all aimed at frailty. And because they didn't have enough cases, they were starting to go and look for them. And it might just be they saturated it. And maybe you don't need a full 5-day-a-week, 7-day-a-week service for frailty in a city that's very young. Maybe you need something else. So first thing is, what needs are we trying? What is the problem we're trying to solve with an integrated neighborhood team? Here's a set of other practices and similar issues around cohorts. The brown one is the older over 70s, and you can see age-wise, there's working age, 1 or 2 long-term conditions is that sort of dark pink. So we might not know who they are, and we have to go and find out, and we have to investigate them. And if you look back at this practice in Hastings, you'll see there's 44 people who are 35 years or younger. They had no idea what was going on there. Didn't even know they were turning up frequently. This practice went and met with some of those folk to find out and to co-design a service that would suit them. It turned out it was something they could do in their general practice. They didn't need to escalate it, which was fantastic. All righty. Let's have a look at continuity. So the first thing we need to do to keep things as low as possible so they don't escalate into a wider team requirement is to provide continuity in general practice. So where we have clinical complexity and we provide continuity, we can keep more people in the hands of the general practitioner. But again, most general practices don't know how much continuity they're offering. So again, this is another study. In one practice, only 3 people with complex needs actually had continuity, i.e. for over 50% of the time, they were going back to see the same clinician. Now, continuity can be, as I was saying before, between 1 or 2 people, but you're talking about less handovers. As you can see across that chart, all those different colors of different people, different clinicians. And so some of these folks who needed continuity because they're complex and turning up frequently, we're seeing lots and lots and lots of people. We won't be meeting their needs. You're talking about that ambulance chart, aren't you, with the bouncing person? Nick did this very nice piece of work in a general practice and has done it repeatedly, coming out with very similar solutions. And what he's saying, what you can see here is that when you look at people who are in general practice, and you just look at their social context as well as their clinical context. So left-hand side is medical complexity, top is social complexity. You'll see there's a lot of people turning up in general practice who are under pressure. There's a small group who are turbulent. That's where you need those high intensity teams working with people who have got who are very traumatized, who've got high intensity needs. You'll know them. They might be your celebrity patients, or they might be people who are well known to social services as well as yourselves. So put those folks aside. They're not the solution. They're not going to be an INT. They're not going to need an INT. But you might find some of these folks who have got medium complexity and who have got that social context pressure. Maybe that's where we need to be pushing a bit more support and effort, because general practice is pretty good at the stuff that's on the left, the green box, where things are stable. They manage that really, really well, but they need help as we get into a more difficult, what you might call troubled life. So we think there are 3 types of cohorts for integrated neighbourhood teams. The first one is known need, known approach. So for instance, frailty in care homes. We know we have people who've got complex needs. We know they need continuity. We know they tend to need more than clinical support and clinical help. We usually need some help from the community, the voluntary sector. We might need some help, the ambulance trust and out of hours. So for those folks, we know the sort of big mix, and it's quite a lot of people. The challenge we've got with that cohort is trying to reduce the touch points so that there are not all those handovers. So having sorted out, most of you have sorted out data sharing and all sorts of issues around decision making. And next thing is how do we make that into the smallest team possible to do the most work for those folks so that they do feel like a knitted and integrated team? And the reason why that works at neighbourhood level is because your voluntary community sectors primarily comes out of the assets of the community. So voluntary sectors arise out of local need and tend to be knitted into local communities. They're very well connected to faith groups and to volunteers. So fabulous resource that you will absolutely need for some of those folks. So cohort 1, we know who they are. Cohort 2, discovered need, known approach. So phenomenal emergence, hasn't there been, of children and young people's mental health. We know that doesn't all need secondary care interventions. There's masses we can be doing in the community, and there's masses we can be doing with voluntary community sectors. In Bradford, you should see the brilliant resources the VCSE is putting in 2 schools around dance to help teach people about social media, buddies and peer support from apprentices, alongside clinicians, alongside the NHS, alongside community services. Absolutely fabulous. So there's a discovered need, there's a known approach, because there's people who are doing this now across the country who are really trying to meet those children and young people's needs, particularly around anxiety, particularly around the sort of the level below the need for any secondary care services. There's some pathway around, but we're just not organised around it yet, and we need to be. So that might be a cohort you'd be interested in. And the cohort 3 is a discovered need and an unknown approach. So when we've been looking at those folks, and you see that 35 years and younger, there are some times when you start looking in general practice and looking at people turning up frequently, you find some folks. And when you look at it across a number of PCNs or practices and PCNs, you might find something that you were surprised about. It could be carer stress, it could be alcoholism, it could be people who are victims or experiencing domestic violence. So let's take that last one. As we've discovered this, we don't really know what to do. Actually, maybe the voluntary community sector knows a lot more about what to do about that. And we need to partner and collaborate with those folks. We need to partner and collaborate with people who've got better expertise and better skills to offer, so that we can do our absolute best, but we're not the lead partner here for this work. We're going to support and enable. So I think there are 3 types of cohorts that we tend to think about integrated neighbourhood teams just as that cohort 1, but I think we're going to get into cohort 2 and cohort 3. And if we do that, then we're going to start pointing collaborative services at needs, which should reduce demand, both on general practice, but also on A&E and community services. So I hope that's really helpful. I'm going to put this on my blog. If you find me, you'll find it under Becky Malby Learning Journeys, and it'll also give you some links to the evidence base. I hope that was helpful.